Hello again. We've talked about creating the strategic plan. We've talked about a variety of different sources that you would get your information from that would let you do that. Now we're going to pivot over and talk about actually translating that plan into concrete actions. Now, in many ways, this is maybe the most important part. It's the rubber hits the road part of it. And there's really an awful lot of skill and finesse and certainly some art involved in translating a kind of a like an artificial kind of construct plan into concrete actions, particularly the larger the organization, because the more difficult it is to get all of the individual roles coordinated in a particular set of activities. Now, your planning translation to action will drive, there'll be a bunch of action plans that you have to come up with, which who does what and when and in what circumstances. There's activities around resource allocation and deployment, right? So these people are going to do this, this is going to do this. Often it's got to do with making financial investments. And as I've gone back to before, almost every organization is resource constrained. So making an investment in one area necessarily usually means that you can't make this, an investment in somewhere else. So you're making trade-off decisions. Really, really, really big part of your planning, your translation, and then actually driving the change that's supposed to fulfill the plan is how do you know what success looks like? Because really it's not an end destination. Although by your strategy you're kind of envisioning a place that you're going to, and there'll certainly be some higher level objectives that hopefully are things that you achieve at a particular point in time. To some degree, a lot of it, certainly in the shorter time period, is kind of aspirational and you're moving towards it. You need to know whether you're making progress and what kind of progress you're making. And that comes down to your measurements, right? So your organizational performance measurements. And then obviously we need to talk a little bit about the role of quality in this deployment function itself. So an action plan is, how do I translate a strategy to action? We want to be, the fastest to be able to deliver this particular service. Well, what kind of things do you need to do? First of all, where are you? Where are all your competitors? What's the target you're trying to hit for fastest? Like, define what your fastest target is that you're trying to go for. You'd have to look at the process of what you're doing and where you could potentially make changes to be faster. In a lot of it, you want to try to find things that are going to be relatively more difficult for your competitors to match, because that will give you a little more staying power. But ultimately, you're going to have to come up with a series of actions, right? So it's this systematic, okay, I'll do this and you'll do this. And then you see that it tends to break itself down in various different organized parts of the organization. Now, there'll be maybe all kinds of different details that may show up in these action plans. So objectives are very, very important. Scope, start and stop. What's considered in the scope of the project, what's not. What are you looking to deliver out of the whole thing? So what's the final result of what the project is supposed to be? Are there dependencies on other things that are going on at the time? There'll be some assumptions that you'll go into it with that, depending on the length of the project, the assumptions will likely prove to be perhaps not accurate for the reality. So you'll have to make some changes along the way. How much money, what resources, like all kinds of things like this. And ultimately, you got a bunch of these going on in an organization in various different places, right? So there'll be, at a high level, what does finance need to do over the next 5 years to help us achieve what we're looking to do? And then within finance, there may be specific things they have to change. So one of the things might be, hey, we're gonna have to revamp our accounting system so that we have the capacity to do the kind of volumes that we're looking to do. So then there's a whole action plan around, what do we look at for changes to the system? Do we replace it? Can we augment what's there? So there'd be a whole project around looking at what those kinds of things are, right? So that kind of gives you that an idea of those pieces. And in all of it, there's resource allocation. So you may move management around and leadership depending on the areas. It's very common actually in areas or towards projects that are really really important for an organization to kind of pivot towards a new direction. They'll move their strongest leadership onto those particular projects or areas. You may reallocate resources. You may change kind of what you ask of people. I'm going to be careful because there are absolute cultural implications for changing what you ask of your employees. I'm not saying they're necessarily bad, but there are cultural implications to doing it that need to be considered. And unfortunately, I think often in organizations, they don't think of those because the cultural impacts are usually not really short-term felt things, they're longer-term felt things. Just one thing that pops to mind thinking about that is, so I was reading in the paper something because there's some concern about whether there'll be the same demand for office space going forward now that more and more people have had to work at home and there's been more distance stuff going on in the workplace. And so there's some places, like there's a pretty successful tech organization here in Canada called Shopify, that Shopify basically does the online, shopping cart technology, website, like all of that kind of stuff for all kinds of operators. The back end is actually Shopify that's doing it, not anyone else. Well, Shopify has talked about that, hey, everybody's just going to keep working from home. We're just, we're going to do everything remotely. One of the implications with doing stuff remotely is how do you imbibe and how do you support a particular organizational culture remotely? Well, I'm not going to say they can't do it. I am going to say it's very difficult. I know when I managed a mixed team and I had people that were in market, so remote from us, and I had people on site like team here, it was really, really difficult to be able to ascertain the differences, or it was very difficult to be able to support the cultural norms and making them feel included and things like that when they were remote versus being in place. So going to be some challenges with that stuff. Anyhow, back to the stuff. Allocation of resources, right? Which is usually money, but isn't entirely. It could be facilities. It could be equipment. It could be inventory. It could be all kinds of other things. It's very, very commonly money related, though. You're going to have to figure out a tactical level deployment. And I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here because I think, this diagram does a better job. You start at the top, right? So overall enterprise, where are we going? What does it look like? What's our mission? What are we willing to do? What are we not willing to do? Kind of all of those things that feed into what we see as being the path that's going to resonate with the customers that we're trying to target. And then in order to do that, each of the divisions, what do they have to do? Right? So if you have multiple divisions in an organization, each division would have a contribution to that overall piece. What's their contribution look like? Departmental. So if there's a division, you can go directly to departmental, which is kind of like, okay, for the overall company thing, what does sales have to do? What does marketing have to do? What does finance have to do? What does, right? Into each of those. And then they cascade down to individual, department levels and sub levels and ultimately to individual. So there's this cascading of these pieces going through. And one of the things that happens is the performance measures will be in a similar vein, but they will become a lot more granular as you work your way down, because the details start to come out more as you get to the more to the frontline levels. So although like at the higher enterprise objectives, there may be things about percentage of market share and so on and so forth, when you work your way down to the individual action plan in sales, for example, it could be a certain sales quota. It could be, it could be a quota of a certain number of new customers over a particular period of time. It may be something like that, which with all the other individual plans and under the department and under the division ultimately leads towards the market share metric that starts with the top. So they're all interlinked, but they become more granular as you work your way down. Now, as I've mentioned before, very, very, very important is you got to know what success looks like. So you got to be able to measure what that looks like. And there are more measurements that are more meaningful. Very commonly, businesses fall back on using short-term financial measures. And part of the reason they do is because they're accessible, right? So it's pretty easy to look at what your sales number was. It's pretty easy to look at what your actual margin is. It's pretty easy to look at like all of those things because you're accounting for all that stuff anyhow. And certainly there are important aspects to it for sure, but they don't necessarily capture health of the business information, right? They're a little piece of it, but they're a short-term piece of it. They're in the your review mirror, but they're not necessarily reflective of other views. And in fact, in future, we're going to look at, I think, I don't know if it's the next one or in a couple going forward, we're going to look at strategy maps and balanced scorecard and things like that, which look at much broader sense of measures to get an overall sense of where the organization is going. And they're really good tools for translating like a strategy and a plan into actual demonstrated actions within the organization. Anyhow, very common approach and a great way to do this is look at your critical success factors, which will be very specific to your organization and to your industry. Now, typically you would use 8 to 12 of these CSFs in combination, and some of them probably are financial measurements. But the idea is to give you a rounder sense of what your business actually looks like. So, quick example, when I had my cell phone repair business, absolutely, critical success factors for me were revenue for the month, my maintained margin. I also looked at what was my percentage of expenses to revenue, right? Because was another big one for me. And then I had other measurements that I captured that were very indicative of different aspects of what was going on. So the revenue and the margins and so on and so forth, there are, there's effects of how many customers you see and all the stuff like that are embedded in it, but it isn't specifically about that. They're more holistic in nature, right? So their overall volume, how you get to your volume could be very different, right? I could have one customer, buy an absolute ton of stuff, right? Versus all kinds of smaller transactions. And there's implications to either way, but you wouldn't see it in an overall revenue number. That's one of the values in having CSFs is that each one gives you kind of a slightly different view. So in addition to those ones that I mentioned, what I did is I had a tracker on the door that measured door swings. And that was my approximation of traffic, because my business was certainly one, and a lot of actual like retail business, you can't sell somebody that doesn't come through the door. So traffic is a key component of your success measurements. I had another one that was taking the traffic measurement versus the number of invoices that we closed in a day. And that was what I called conversion. So that had to do with, of the traffic that comes through the store, how many are we actually transacting with? And then I had another measurement that we pulled out of our system every day that I looked at daily sales, right? Which gave me a sense of what was going on. And I would aggregate that over a month, but it gave me some sense of flow of things that were going on. And I tracked this data, right? So like the door swings, the things that you do to try to generate traffic ultimately, hopefully have a positive effect on the business. But traffic doesn't 100% equate to more business necessarily. Just because you send someone through the door doesn't mean you get something from it. There's a much better chance that you will, and you can't get it if you don't send them through the door. But just sending them through the door doesn't necessarily give you all of the other things. If you engage in an activity to drive traffic, right? So sales promotions and things like that are designed to generate traffic. You want to measure traffic, not necessarily just sales. Yes, you want it to lead to that, but there's other things in the way of it getting there. So you don't want to exclusively just look at, well, I did this ad and then our sales look like this, because there's lots of stuff that could have affected the number to the positive or negative. You want as much as possible to have your measurements be indicative of specific things that you're doing or specific aspects. So you can know, did I have the result I was looking for in that aspect, right? One of the other things that we did is, although the traffic did vary depending on the day of the week and the month, and it had seasonal and daily patterns and stuff, my conversion was pretty consistent, which was interesting because it seemed to be a fairly consistent measure all round. So one of the things that I started to look at was, are there things that I can do that fundamentally change the relationship between the customer traffic and the number of invoices? So are there things that I can do that will make us more efficient? Okay. That's got nothing to do with like trying to get people to buy more stuff when they're there, which is also a good thing to do, but wouldn't show up in that measurement, right? It would show up in another one. And actually, I generated some B2B business where I would have business customers that I would get multiple devices from them that we could fix and then return. That fundamentally changed my conversion number going forward once I added to that. So these things are give you important views on different aspects of your organization, because you really want a more rounded view of your performance measurements, not just short term in the rearview mirror financial ones. So there's two examples here on the slide, right? So in a not-for-profit, one of the key things that's common in any not-for-profit organization is you have to have sufficient revenue to support whatever the activities are that you do. And as a not-for-profit, you're not generating profit, right? Profit is the ability for you to continue to grow and scale your business potentially. There's no profit component. So you're 100% determined to be able to continue to capture whatever revenue is that you need to do the work that you're doing. So in this case, just two examples that they might look at is one of them had to do with the number of subscribers or people that were supporting them, and another had to do with the actual, growth of the amount of money that they had. The two are very related, but they're different. I could get the fund growth, but I could have fewer subscribers. I could have more subscribers, but I could go down in the fund growth. Each measures a slightly different aspect. And that's an important variable, right? In the other one, they're using, again, financial figures, because like I said, they're commonly available and they're accessible. So they often get used. Sales expansion and pre-tax income. They're going to be related, because the more I sell, the more pre-tax income I should have, but they're not 100% the same thing. If I don't do a good job of managing expenses or things like that, I can get the sales I'm looking for, but my income can go down because I'm less efficient at what I'm doing. So although they're related, and you'll find that's common because there'll be kind of key aspects about any particular business that you'll tend to have stuff related to, it is not the exact same thing. Whatever measures gets done. Another variation of that statement is often, you can't manage what you don't measure, because the measurement is what gives you the feedback mechanism to know what's actually happening. If you try to do it just on impressions that you have, it's kind of tough, because impressions are formed based on your opinions and values and what you see and what you hear, and like it's very, very personally subjective. There's some people who are really good at doing it, right? They have really good instincts and stuff like that, but like as a system, not a good way to approach it, because it's very, very person dependent. And to have the skills to do that is not common, right? Whereas it makes much more sense, and it would totally be the TQM way to do it, to have a process for how you did it and be consistent with the process. That involves measuring things that are important in a consistent and accurate way, and using those measurements to tell you what's actually happening. Now, there are implications to measurements, right? So particularly ones that are the non-financial ones, is that you usually have to do something about measuring it, right? So for me, for the door traffic, I bought this little thingy that goes on the front door, and it's a magnetic switch. And every time the switch goes open, it counts something. And there's a little, LCD screen on it. And every night when the guys closed the store, they would give me a reading from that thing, right on a Post-it note, and leave it on my desk. So I'd have a door number for the next day. Not a lot of expense involved in doing that. It wasn't anything that was that would interrupt the flow of customers. There wasn't anything that kind of messed with the feel of the store. Like, it was pretty unobtrusive, which is ultimately usually what you're looking for in any of your measurements. Things that are inexpensive, that are consistent, that are, hopefully not overly visible, or certainly don't have a detrimental effect on the way you do business. right? Where versus having somebody stand at a door, and ask customers things every time they came through the door, that would be expensive and it would be disruptive as well. Um, One of the other implications of measurements is that there's usually somebody who's compiling these measurements, right? So there's some people cost involved in doing it. Now, more and more stuff is computerized these days, so you can actually get reports out. But in a lot of cases, somebody had to create the routine to run the report or create the dashboard or whatever you're using for it the first time, right? And then once it's in, okay, sure, it'll auto-populate from the system going forward, but things break from time to time, so someone will have to fix it. And so it's still there's some costs involved in doing it. You want to make sure that you're going to do something with the measurements that you're getting, so that you get return for the investment you're making in doing them. And the other part is you want to be careful, because there is a tendency of things that get measured get done. If you measure the wrong things, you'll focus on the wrong things. So you do have to be careful of that too. There's a bunch of factors that influence how frequently you would take your measurements, right? So is it a trend measurement or a control output? You would measure at different intervals depending on what each of those is going to do, right? So trend is up or down, and it would have a lot to do with expectation. Hey, I really expect to see this going up next week. And then you would be looking for the measurement to see, does it actually go up kind of what I thought it was going to. A control output is usually, to some degree, my conversion was like a control output, is that there was an expectation that there was kind of a consistent number. And if you saw a difference one way or another, right, it was a little bit like a control chart kind of thing, and it was like breaking one of the limits where you go, hang on a second, something's happened, because I'm seeing a behavior that is not one that was expected, right? I've talked about, the time and the money spent doing it, and interruption to the business. Rate of change, right? So how often do I measure something? Do I do it, once a day, once a week, once a month, once a year, right? And a lot of it's got to do with the time. It's got to do with the rate of change of what you're measuring. It's also got to do with what's your likelihood to be able to react to it. If I measure something once a quarter and it takes me 2 quarters to respond to something, I can be like potentially a year out in a response to something. If I take the same relationship, but it's monthly, right? Then within a quarter, I've responded to the same thing. I'm not saying one's better than the other. It really depends on the situation. The once a quarter might be sufficient in some circumstances. You may need faster than that in others. And that's why so many of these things are situationally dependent. Degree of control, which goes to how long does it take me to fix anything about it, or can I fix anything about an unfavorable change? Consequences, which is the business risk, right? So if I don't respond in time to this, what does that mean, right? How much does it cost us? Because ultimately, that's usually how stuff comes down. And then very, very often you need a baseline. Now, when you first measure stuff, you don't have any context, right? So it's one of the big values of measuring, is to start to give you context, because the actual numbers that you generate on their own may not mean anything. They mean something in the context of what was it last month, what was it year over year, same period, things like that, so that you kind of have a sense of where things kind of fit in. Why are you measuring? And if you're not going to do anything with that measure, I would say don't measure it. What are you measuring, right? And you want to make sure that you're measuring things that are, it says key process elements, or what I would say is like, think health of the business, right? What are indicative of health of the business? And each one should measure something that's a little different than the one before. They'll probably be interrelated, but they should be a little bit distinct from each other. And that when you mesh them all together, it should give a fairly decent rounded view of the health of your business. Where to measure, it says as close as possible to variation, right? So for me, when I was measuring the door, if you're outside the store, you're not traffic. you're inside the store, your traffic. So right at the threshold is where you would make that measurement. You wouldn't try to measure it at the front cash desk, right? Not to mention it would be really difficult to figure out how to do that, but even so, it's just, you do it as close to where the variation is going to be. If you're measuring for, if there's a key process element that has to do with, I don't know, hardness rating of something coming out of a process, when does the thing come out of the process? When's the first point that it would have that hardness rating? And that's where you would do the measurement, right? Incidentally, when you're doing inspecting, it's the same deal, right? As soon as you're just far enough along to get to that right point is where you do your inspection. When to measure, right? So as often as necessary, but not more often. You do it too often and you create noise. If you don't do it frequently enough, you don't necessarily have the detail in the patterns. So you have to figure out what's the right cadence. And it is totally business related, right? When I was measuring traffic, I was only worried about the day. So I didn't aggregate by hour. I have a buddy that owns hair salons. And one of the key things that you have to do in that business is scheduling, which is all about having staff available when you need them, but not there when you don't need them. Because staff there without customers just costs you money. But you can't cut somebody's hair if there isn't somebody there to do it. And there's a finite amount of time that people are willing to wait for, for them to cut your hair. So the secret sauce is about scheduling people. You absolutely would track traffic by hour in that scenario, because you're looking to do something different with that measurement than I was looking to do. Now, they're both very related things. They're both about getting people through the door and stuff like that. But there's a further implication in his, in that it's got to do with how they would staff. I wouldn't staff any different, as I was going to before, because we could manage the flow of business differently than that other example. And then how to measure, and this is before. You want it something that doesn't become an impediment to you doing business. So something that is unobtrusive. And more, a lot of the technological solutions that have been developed tend to be pretty unobtrusive.